6 creepy tales and true stories, read by various narrators. The narrators' channels will be linked in the description, along with the stories. Nothing like working third shift at your local drugstore by Nereal Charday, narrated by Creep Reads. I'm a 26-year-old female who's about 5 foot nothing and generally harmless looking. I have no idea what it is about being seemingly harmless, but it seems to attract a whole array of bad news. Don't believe me? Go ask a soft-spoken tiny girl who gives you the first impression of, isn't she adorable? And more than likely, she'll have enough stories to make you worry about your sanity. This is compounded by my overall attitude of, I'll be sugar, rainbows and sunshine, right up until you give me a reason not to be. A job in retail makes the whole mess about as fun as bamboo splinters under your fingernails. Whoever came up with the idea of the customer is always right needs to be shot, resurrected, and shot again. That said, I'll do anything within the limits of my job for a customer. I like helping customers out. Most retail workers do. A little lesson is to be had here for those who have never worked in a service-based company. Most employees want to help you. Let them, and you'll both walk away from the encounter in a much better frame of mind. If they don't, you should ask yourself if it's a situation beyond their control. If the answer is even anywhere close to it might be, let them off the hook. I've seen too many retail employees get a look of dread on their face when something goes wrong, as I myself am out being a customer. It bothers me every single time because I know what it's like to think, great, now I'm gonna get yelled at and called names for something that isn't even my fault, or if they're mad enough, they might even call in about me, and then my boss will be wondering what in God's name I'm doing. You know what said employee can do about it? Just sit there and take it, while apologizing for your inconvenience. But I digress. I work as an overnight supervisor to a 24-hour drugstore. We get plenty of creepy people in, being a fair-sized city with only 2 24-hour pharmacies in town. I have some really weird stories. Maybe I'll tell a few more at a later date. The evening of this particular incident had me working on a Saturday night with 2 other front-end employees. Saturday nights mean ad tags. We overnighters, the few, the lucky, and the ones stuck with the joyful job. It means 10 hours of monotony and a lot of back and forth around the store. Usually the nights pass with some regulars, some meth heads and drunks, some regular meth heads and drunks, and the occasional sick person or person with a sick loved one at home. Most intoxicated persons are in and out like a flash, but I've noticed, the more out of their wits they are, the higher potential for creepy is. So you learn to watch the ones with nervous twitches. It was about 1:30 a.m. when the taller, wiry man walked into my store. His dark brown hair was cropped pretty short, and he was dressed fairly casually. I didn't even realize his presence in the store until the cashier for that night, Daniel, came up to me and muttered something about the weird guy wandering around the front of the store. Daniel was middle-aged, but mischievous and crotchety are 2 very apt descriptions of him. You never quite know when he's just stirring the pot, so I searched the guy down to see what was bothering Daniel. I had been thinking it was more than likely he'd been noticing something strange about the guy and was worried about shoplifting. This would not be the first or last time his so-called shoplifter turned out to be some poor, exhausted father or husband sent out to get cold medicine. I found him pacing along the front wall and asked if he needed any help in my cheeriest customer service voice. The moment he turned around, I froze. The man radiated subdued violence. It surrounded him like an aura of menace. I couldn't pinpoint what was bothering me. The weirdly still expression maybe, or the way he was standing. He was unnaturally tense during the whole experience with him, like he was ready to go off at the first provocation. Truthfully, I still haven't quite figured it out, but he was just off enough to send up red flags just looking at him. Immediately uncomfortable. I was all too happy when he muttered, "No, I'm, just looking." I never figured out how to gracefully exit the situation when a customer has nothing left to say to you but still stands there, staring, which feels almost expectant, even if it's not. After a minute or so of avoiding meeting his eyes, I told him my usual line of, Alright, well, let us know if you need anything. I backed into the aisle I'd emerged from and hurried off to busy myself with more ad tags. Daniel could keep an eye on him if he felt like it. Dude was scary and I was the only female on shift. No thank you, they don't pay me enough. It's not long before I start to feel like I'm being watched, and creepy suspect number 1 is lurking at the top of the aisle, staring. I finish all of the tags in line for that aisle, and I'm relieved when I have to move across the store for others in a different section. Again, a few moments later pass, and that weird prickly feeling hits me, and he's at the end of the aisle, staring right at me. I ask for the second time if I can help him find anything, and he pretends to busy himself with some vitamins he picked up at random. He gave a creepy grin and told me again that he was just looking. Yeah, sure, I just bet you were. This continues for another half hour or so, until I find myself heading up to the front to ring up a customer. I had no idea where Daniel was, but it didn't matter. I was grateful for the distraction. That was until I noticed the creeper following me up to the register, still staring. I conducted the transaction as quickly as possible, and after a few too many nervous glances in my creeper's direction, the customer took off like someone had lit him on fire. I decided to go outside for my lunch break. It was cold and I thought maybe, since Mr. Creeper didn't have a particularly warm-looking coat on, he'd leave me alone. I searched out one of my co-workers and let them know my intentions, clocked out, and stepped outside and into my car. Now, normally I try to avoid smoking in my car. I've never liked the way it stinks up a car, but desperate times, desperate measures. I locked the car doors and rolled down the window just far enough to fit my cigarette through, to ash it. I picked up a book, turned to the page I'd left off on, and settled in. A few paragraphs later, I heard someone banging on my window. I jumped and looked up. Guess who? That's right, Mr. Creepy. He grinned at me in what I'm sure was supposed to be a sheepish fashion, but it came out more Norman Bates, if you know what I mean. I again asked him if I could help him, and he said he'd been looking for something in particular that he'd like my help with. I told him firmly that there were 2 other employees in the store that would have to help him. I was off the clock. He frowned, and after a moment of me pointedly ignoring him in favor of tensely not being able to concentrate on my book, he went back inside. My lunch break ended, and I still hadn't seen him come back out. I hurried inside, clocked in, and called the other shift supervisor, Mark, into the office. I explained the situation and asked him if he could go deal with the dude. Mark sighed, nodded, and went to talk to the guy. I busied myself in the office with some training sessions I'd been putting off for a while. Mark came back inside the office, wearing a very bewildered look. I raised an eyebrow and he sat down. That guy was really weird. Weird is not quite the adjective I'd use. What did he say? He wanted to talk to you again. I told him you had other things you needed to be doing, but I'd be happy to help him. That agitated him. You thought he was freaky beforehand. He visibly shuddered, and I raised an eyebrow again. He asked if I knew what time he got off or where you lived. What the fuck? I said. Exactly. I told him we were legally obligated not to share such information, and that if he wasn't going to buy anything, he needed to leave. Then he left. I followed him out just in case. He was looking around your car until he noticed I followed, and then he got into his car and left. I decided I wasn't going to stick around to see if he was going to come back and note out of the rest of my shift. Shortly after, my store set up a guard contract with the local police department, and I haven't seen him since. Christine Chubbuck's suicide video, narrated by Stuart Schlomach.
On July 14th, 1974, the talk show host Christine Chubbuck was set to air her morning program, Suncoast Digest, on Channel 40. She confused staff by stating that she had to recite a newscast first, something that she never normally did before her program. The first 8 minutes of the newscast went ahead with complete normalcy, until Chubbuck reported a news story that had happened the previous day. a shooting at a local restaurant. When the news footage cued to play jammed and didn't run, Chubbuck, who we now know was suffering heavily from depression, nonchalantly turned to the camera and said, "In keeping with Channel 40's policy of bringing you the latest in blood and guts, and in living color, you are going to see another first attempted suicide." She drew a revolver, shot herself behind the right ear, and fell forward violently, at which point the camera faded quickly to black. Many people who saw the live broadcast rang both the station and the police. Many weren't sure if it was a morbid joke, or if it had actually happened. Some of the WXLT TV staff had doubted its legitimacy at first. After Chubbuck was rushed to Sarasota Memorial Hospital, news director Mike Simmons discovered that the papers from which she had been reading her broadcast contained a follow-up story, written herself, describing her suicide attempt. The follow-up story read something to the effect of, TV40 news personality Christine Chubbuck shot herself in a live broadcast this morning on Channel 40 talk program. She was rushed to Sarasota Memorial Hospital, which she had accurately predicted, where she remains in critical condition. Chubbuck was pronounced dead the day after. The network's master tape was subsequently seized as evidence by authorities. It was eventually returned to Chubbuck's family, who are said to have destroyed it. As the broadcast aired in 1974, and several primitive forms of videocassette recorders were released in the early 1970s, such as the U-matic, which came out in 1971, it is entirely possible, albeit unlikely, that another recording exists elsewhere. Although until proof of such recording is unearthed, the video is generally accepted as being impossible to obtain. Having said that, there are some people who claim to have seen the footage via a variety of sources, including early internet sites, FBI training videos, and Faces of Death knockoffs. However, until any solid proof surfaces, these claims remain nothing more than hearsay.
An Experience on the Haunted Ride by Brimstone Below. Narrated by KingSpook.
These events happened to me about 4 years ago, when I spent a year working at one of the largest theme parks in the United Kingdom. This place is about half an hour from where I live, and while I won't name it directly, I'm sure a few of you can guess where it is. I worked there as a ride assistant and worked on several different rides, including 3 of the big coasters and a couple of the dark rides. For those who don't know, a dark ride is basically a ride that's completely indoors. The most common example of this is your typical ghost train. Now, one particular ride is based partly inside the ruins of the family estate from which the park gets its name. The ride tells a pretty well-known local story about the family that used to own the estate, and a supposed curse that they were afflicted with. The ride would start with an indoor queuing area, before moving guests into a cinema which told them the story, and then to a place known as the Octagon Room, where there would be a small effect-based show. Then, finally, guests would unknowingly exit the ruins and board the actual ride, which was a haunted swing type affair. The actual ruins are well known for being potentially haunted, with programs such as Most Haunted featuring them, and after my time on that ride, I can 100% agree. One night during October, which is when the park stays open till 9 p.m. to allow guests to ride in the dark, I was sat at the end of the queue line. A member of staff is always stationed here to ensure that there, A, aren't too many people in each group, and B, to greet the guests. Now usually, after about 5 p.m., the ride becomes pretty deserted as most people wanted to ride the roller coasters in the dark, not walk through some very dimly lit building. So my job was really easy. At the end of the queue line, there was a small station with a television screen showing security camera feeds and a direct phone line to the ride operator's cabin. The cameras focused on the outdoor entrance, the entrance queue line, and the cinema area. There weren't any blind spots either on these feeds. Now, this night I was doing my usual thing, checking Facebook, playing Angry Birds, and keeping one eye on the monitor when I spotted what I guessed was a young couple making their way up the winding queue, zigzagging their way towards me. I locked my phone and shoved it in my pocket, as sometimes the managers like to try and sneak up on us. As the couple got about 3/4 of the way to me, I turned around to give them a friendly wave and to assure them that the ride was still open and that they would have the place to themselves. They were gone. I stood, staring for a moment in complete puzzlement. There was no way that they could have run out of the room without either opening one of the loud and heavy fire doors or jumping over about 20 sets of metal bars that made up the queue. As my brain processed this information, the hairs on the back of my neck rose and a sudden chill ran through my very core. Needless to say, I was very relieved when a coworker came about 10 minutes later so that I could go for my break. While that was an isolated incident, the next thing happened several times but never really fazed me. Throughout my life, I've had a fair few paranormal encounters and have a certain sense for when something is around, and whether it's benign or not. In the building, the octagon room was the last section of the ruins that guests passed through, and believe it or not, it was a fairly large, octagonal-shaped chamber. Usually, after the show finishes, a thick, heavy curtain is pulled back by a machine to reveal a secret tunnel that guests must follow. About 4 months into the season, this machine broke, and the maintenance staff realized that the part they needed wouldn't be available until after the park closed in November. So rather than pinning back the curtain, the decision was made that one ride assistant would have the fun job of standing behind the curtain in the pitch black, and once each show had finished, they would pull the curtain and allow the guests to pass through, making sure nobody was left behind. More often than not, this duty fell to me. I enjoyed my time sat in the dark. After a week or two, I knew the exact timings of all the light and sound cues of the show, and also scared quite a few people who weren't expecting some guy to be stood behind this mysterious curtain. In fact, many people assumed I was a wax statue, and I would play on this before moving slightly whenever they went in to take a closer look at me. However, every so often I would get an immersive, oppressive feeling washing over me. The room would feel much darker than it had a couple of seconds before, and I would always get the distinct impression that there was some sort of male presence just behind me. Although I never turned around once because fuck that, I always stood my ground, and I knew this presence did not want me nor anybody else there in his area, and he made that quite clear to many other members of staff. There were several reports of female coworkers being pushed from behind while working in that area, or even being pinched. The frequency and nature of this presence soon meant that I was one of the only people who were willing to stand there and endure the intense feeling of hatred that would randomly appear and disappear. All the while, hearing an endless loop of some old hag cackling and whispering curses. I loved it.
I'm Never Going Camping Again by Tiger64, narrated by Let's Read.
I want to start this by saying this is taking a lot for me to finally talk about. I've kept it a secret from my family, and for my friends who were a part of it, we never talked about what happened after that day. But I want to give you a backstory before I drive into details. I've never been much for the city, so living in the suburbs outside of one of the largest cities in Pennsylvania is not my ideal place to live. It's a small town with only a few thousand people living in it, but only a 5-minute drive to the middle of downtown. My friends and I, country boys at heart, frequently would have fires or go fishing, and even go out on camping trips when we had the chance. My 2 best friends and I all played football together and have grown up attached to each other at the hip. We did everything together, so leaving for college was a scary thought, and the not-so-distant future as well. For our last summer together, after our senior year, we decided to go on one last camping trip before we went our separate ways. My 2 best friends, Kevin and Buddha. His real name is Kyle, but only his parents call him that. Wanted to go somewhere that we had never gone camping before. We all agreed to go down to Allegheny National Forest for a weekend of fishing, drinking, and reminiscing. I know, underage drinking, but we were young and dumb, so on Thursday we packed up all of our supplies, fishing poles, bait, beer, and food, and left early Friday morning. The trip took a little over 4 hours, with frequent stops at rest stops to get snacks and drinks because of our lack of planning for the drive. Our parents made sure that we all had our cell phones in case something happened and we needed to call them. Of course, I didn't understand the point of that. If anything happened, they were 4 hours away, but naturally we took them just to make them happy. When we got to the camping area, we kept driving. Being the daredevils that we were, we wanted to be far away from anyone else to give it a real camping feel. We found a beautiful spot right on the edge of the lake, which we all agreed would be a perfect spot to pitch our tent. Because we love to fish, the first thing we did after we got our fire pit and tent ready was take our canoe straight for the lake. It was a beautiful day for fishing. The sun was shining without a cloud in the sky. I even caught a few bass for dinner. So that night we ate up the fish, drank half a case of beer, and told scary stories to freak each other out around the campfire. But something in the back of my mind told me that we were being watched. There were no signs of anyone else there for me to be alarmed, so I didn't say anything to the guys. But it was that type of feeling, almost a sixth sense, saying someone or something is there, just outside the light of the fire. I shook it off and decided to go to bed so I could stop freaking myself out or letting them see me starting to be afraid. The next day we slowly woke up and crawled out of the tent one by one. I cooked up some bacon and eggs, which we had brought in our cooler, and made a delicious plate for each of us. Kevin suggested that we go exploring through the woods, and since I love hiking, I was the first to jump out of my seat. We explored for a few hours, drank a few more beers, cooked up some more food, then took the boat out for some more fishing. We fished for a few hours in the middle of the calm lake. The sun was beginning to set, but night fishing was my cup of tea. But again, I got the feeling we were being watched. This time I couldn't help it. I asked my two best friends if they felt as if they were really alone out on the lake, and the color from both of their faces faded as they stared at me. Kevin and Buddha agreed they felt as if someone was watching us, and Buddha even said he felt the same way last night, without me even mentioning my feelings of last night. At this point, we were all a little worried, but continued to fish because no one wanted to suggest that we leave or go back to shore. It was dark on the lake, with only our small lantern and glowing stick at the ends of our fishing rods. With what seemed like the blink of an eye, we all turned to see a small light in the woods across the lake. The light began to grow to the point it looked like a spotlight in the darkness, not pointing at the spot specifically, but in every direction. We were frozen with fear. I didn't know what to do but stare at it. I heard Kevin mumble, What the hell is that?" I immediately got extremely dizzy, and I believe I passed out, or I got knocked out, I'm not sure. All I know is everything went black. I couldn't see the light, our lantern, or the glowing sticks anymore. The next memory I have is waking up in our tent. Kevin and Buddha were in their sleeping bags, both with a different pair of clothes on from the night before. I had pajamas on that I didn't even remember packing, and my side hurt like there was a razor blade in it. I got out of the tent, and there was a fire in our fire pit with bacon cooking in the pan. Kevin and Buddha woke up equally as confused, asking me what had happened. I personally had no idea. They both described a similar pain throbbing in their sides. I lifted my shirt to see if maybe I had a pine needle jabbed into me without me knowing, and all of our eyes were fixed on the small, now scarred cut on my side. My mind was racing. I had never got cut on my side, much less long enough ago for it to heal and scar. Kevin and Buddha lifted their shirts to find similar scars in the same location on their bodies. Buddha began to freak out now. Our canoe was tied up. The fire was started with breakfast cooking. Our fishing poles, precisely spaced out, leaning up against a tree, had scars on our sides, and we had no idea how we got changed or into our tents. We were terrified. Without looking for an explanation, we packed our things and left immediately. None of us knew what had happened and had no memory after everything went dark. We were too afraid to tell our parents or anyone else. They may even be upset with me sharing this story on Reddit, but I need help. I need to know if this has happened to other people that went camping in the Allegheny Forest, or if this is our own terrible nightmare.
Sokushinbutsu, narrated by Ank Miranda.
Scattered throughout northern Japan are 24 mummified Japanese monks known as Sokushinbutsu. Followers of Shugendo, an ancient form of Buddhism, the monks died in the ultimate act of self-denial. For 3 years, the priest would eat a special diet consisting only of nuts and seeds, while taking part in a regimen of rigorous physical activity that stripped them of their body fat. They then ate only bark and roots for another 3 years and began drinking a poisonous tea made from the sap of the urushi tree, normally used to lacquer balls. This caused vomiting and a rapid loss of bodily fluids, and most importantly, it killed off any maggots that might cause the body to decay after death. Finally, a self-mummifying monk would lock himself in a stone tomb barely larger than his body, where he would not move from the lotus position. His only connection to the outside world was an air tube and a bell. Each day he rang a bell to let those outside know that he was still alive. When the bell stopped ringing, the tube was removed and the tomb sealed. Not all monks who attempted self-mummification were successful. When the tombs were finally opened, some bodies were found to have rotted. These monks were resealed in their tombs. They were respected for their endurance, but they were not worshipped. Those monks who had succeeded in mummifying themselves were raised to the status of Buddha, put on display, and tended to by their followers. The Japanese government outlawed Sokushinbutsu in the late 19th century, though the practice apparently continued into the 20th.
Takaka no Numa Greenland, narrated by Sociopathic Pasta.
In Japan's Fukushima Prefecture, there is an abandoned amusement park known as Takaka no Numa Greenland. It sits in the outskirts of Hobara, a section of the Japanese city of Date. Very little is known about this park, and its exact location is largely unknown. You can't find it on any Japanese map, as it simply isn't there. Supposedly, its coordinates are 37 degrees, 49 to 16 north, 140 degrees, 33, 05, 78 east. But if they are put into Google Maps, the search will be directed to the center of Hobara. This is inaccurate, since the park is hidden in a mountainous, rural area. The only major information known about Takaka no Numa Greenland is that it opened in 1973 and closed 2 years later. Some claim that This was due to poor ticket sales and needed renovations, but locals say that it was because of a significant amount of deaths on rides. Miraculously, the park reopened in 1986, but struggled to remain open due to increased competition from bigger parks such as Tokyo Disneyland, as well as financial trouble. Finally, in 1999, Takaka Greenland closed for good. Following its closure, the amusement park was left to rot. Photographs from urban explorers who have infiltrated the area show a massive amount of decay. The Ferris wheel and roller coaster are covered in rust, the entrance is covered in graffiti, and the premises are being reclaimed by plants. The most notable feature of the park is the dense fog that always looms over it, giving off a Silent Hill feel. Like the information about the area, there is very little photography and video of it. Allegedly, Takaka Greenland was demolished in 2006 and now sits as an empty lot. However, in 2007, a citizen of the United Kingdom named Bill Edwards claimed to have visited an untouched, completely intact park. Supposedly, he took numerous pictures that were identical to those taken before the park's supposed demolition, showing the same rusty, forgotten rides. However, according to rumor, when uploading these photos, only one appeared on his computer. This picture shows the entrance to the park on a foggy night, illuminated by the flash from the camera. In the center of this picture, you can barely make out the figure of what looks like a 6-year-old girl in a white dress. She appears to be staring at the photographer with a serious, indifferent face. The girl has never been identified, and the whereabouts of Bill Edwards are currently unknown.